The provost's daughter enforces every rule on this campus. Last night, she broke every one of them to climb through my window. I should start earlier than that, because none of it makes sense unless you understand what I was before she decided I was worth the fall. My name is Briar Calloway. I was 21 years old and 3 years into a scholarship that had eaten every scrap of pride I had left, and on the Tuesday this started, I was standing in the middle of the financial aid atrium with cranberry juice running down the front of my only good blouse while 40 students watched, and nobody moved to help. It wasn't an accident. Odette Fairweather doesn't have accidents. She has choreography. Oh, she said, watching the stain spread. I thought omegas were supposed to have good reflexes. Laughter went around the room the way cold goes around a house with no insulation, finding every gap. I stood there with my scholarship renewal folder clutched to my chest like it might catch fire too, and I did the thing I had trained myself to do since I was 14, and presented in a locker room full of girls who never let me forget it. I made myself small. I made myself quiet. I made myself the kind of nothing nobody bothers finishing off. The suppressant patch on my inner arm had been overdue for replacement for 6 days because I could not afford the copay and make rent in the same month, and my scent, parchment and marigold, my mother used to say, like an old book somebody left open in a garden, had started doing what unmedicated omega scent does under stress. It soured. Sharp and vinegar bright, loud enough that 3 alphas by the door actually turned their heads, and Odette smiled like I'd handed her a gift. Someone should really report that, she said. It's a code violation. Unregulated scent in a shared space. I could cite you myself. That was when the room went quiet in a different way. Not laughing quiet. Held breath quiet. I didn't need to turn around to know why. I'd heard about her the way every underclassman hears about her within the first week, in the hushed, half-frightened tone people use for weather systems and tax audits. The statute. Provost Voss's daughter, chief of campus conduct enforcement, 26 years old and already the most feared authority on a campus of 9,000 students, a woman who had once suspended a tenured professor for parking in a fire lane. She did not raise her voice. People said she'd never needed to. Miss Fairweather. The voice was low and even, and it landed in that atrium like a stone dropped into still water. Cite her for what, exactly, being assaulted with a beverage. I turned. She was tall in the way that made rooms rearrange themselves around her, dark hair pulled back with surgical precision, a slate gray coat that probably cost more than my tuition, and eyes the color of weather about to turn. Her scent reached me half a second after her voice did, wet slate and black tea leaves, cold and steeping. The kind of scent that told you exactly nothing about what was underneath it. That was, I would learn, the entire design of her. I was defending the code, Odette said, recovering fast, the way people who've never really lost always recover fast. Unregulated scent is a documented hazard. Larkin. It's Miss Voss on duty, and I wrote that statute. Larkin Voss did not look at Odette when she said it. She looked at me, at the juice soaking through cotton, at the suppressant patch peeling at its edge on my arm, and something in her face went very still and very careful, like a woman doing math she didn't want to be doing. Section 4, subsection 2. Scent irregularity caused by documented economic hardship is exempted from citation and instead triggers a wellness referral. I'll be filing yours myself. That's not, Odette started. That's the rule, Larkin said. You're welcome to appeal it to my mother's office. I'll have popcorn. Nobody laughed this time, but I felt the atrium exhale. Larkin Voss pulled a small, battered notebook from her coat pocket, leather gone soft and pale at the corners from years of handling, and wrote something in it without looking up again. I would come to know that notebook better than I knew my own class schedule. Everyone called it the statutes book. She called it, when she finally told me, the only inheritance from her mother that had ever made sense to her. "Miss Calloway," she said, and I startled because I hadn't told her my name. "Report to the wellness office by 5. That's not a request. And go home first." Change, a pause, so brief I almost missed it. "You shouldn't have to stand in that." Then she was gone, coat snapping around the corner like punctuation, and I stood in the wreckage of my own humiliation, holding a folder that would determine whether I stayed in school, wondering how a woman famous for having no mercy had just handed me the only kindness I'd been given all semester. I didn't understand yet that mercy for Larkin Voss was not the exception to the rules. It was the rule she'd been building her entire life to protect. I found out 3 nights later, in the sub-basement of the Founder's archive, that competence is a language too, and that some people can hear it from across a room. I worked the archive 4 nights a week for $11 an hour, cataloging and conserving documents nobody else wanted to touch because the pay was bad and the hours were worse. It was the only place on campus where I felt like the thing I actually was instead of the thing everyone decided I must be. My father had taught me paper before he taught me almost anything else. He'd been a book conservator, gone 6 years now, and I still measured foxing and ink migration with his voice narrating in my head. It was, I would eventually admit to Larkin, the one place grief and usefulness lived in the same room without fighting. That Thursday, a graduate assistant dropped an entire crate of 19th century admissions ledgers down 2 steps, and half of them slid into a puddle of burst pipe water pooling under the east shelving. And the department head started shouting about 100 years of institutional record dissolving in real time, and everyone in the room froze the way people freeze when the crisis is bigger than their training. I didn't freeze. I'd read enough about water damage and iron gall ink to know that panic would kill more pages than the water would. "Don't blot them," I said, already moving, already peeling my cardigan off to use as a barrier between wet stack and dry shelf. "Interleave with blotting paper. Don't stack them wet. Don't use heat. We need to air separate them flat within the hour or the ink migrates, and we lose the signatures permanently." "Who put her in charge?" Someone muttered. "I did," said a voice from the doorway, and I looked up to find Larkin Voss standing there in a rumpled coat, doing an unannounced facilities audit at 9 at night like the terrifying insomniac she apparently was, watching me save 100 years of the university's memory with my bare hands and a cardigan. I worked for 40 minutes while she stood absolutely silent against the doorframe. And by the end of it, every ledger was flat, separated, drying, safe. The department head actually thanked me by name, which had never happened before. Larkin said nothing at all until everyone else had filed out, giddy with relief, and it was just the 2 of us and the smell of wet paper and her steeping tea scent gone thick and close in the small room. "You did that in under an hour," she said. "Alone, I've done it before. Smaller scale." I wrung out my ruined cardigan, suddenly aware of how I must look, soaked, shaking slightly, scent still faintly sour from 3 days of rationed patches. My father was a conservator. He died when I was 15. I don't know why I told her that. I hadn't told anyone at Kingsmere that, not even Dee, not in those exact plain words. I finished what he started, I guess. Larkin looked at the ledgers, then at me, and something shifted behind her eyes, like weather deciding which way to break. "The Provost's office needs a conservation assistant with document authentication training for the restricted collection. Paid. Full tuition offset for the semester." A beat. I'm not offering you charity, Miss Calloway. I'm offering you a job you're better qualified for than anyone currently employed by this university, including the man who dropped that crate. Why does the Provost's office need document authentication? Because forgery is a rule violation, she said, and there was something underneath the flatness of it, something old and tired and careful. And I intend to catch every single one on this campus before I graduate. I didn't know yet that she meant it as a promise to a dead girl. I only knew that when she held out her hand to help me up off the wet floor, my pulse did something it had never done for another living person, and that her scent, up close, wasn't cold at all. It was cold the way stone is cold in the morning, before the sun finds it. Waiting to be warmed. I said yes. Of course, I said yes. By the end of that week, I had a keycard to the Provost's restricted wing, a security clearance that made the beta at the front desk raise her eyebrows, and a scent signature that had apparently, without my permission, started registering as hers to the building's alpha keyed doors, because Larkin had listed me as her authorized second without telling me first. You could have asked, I said, the first morning the door recognized me before I badged in. I could have, she agreed, not looking up from the ledger she was annotating. I filed the paperwork instead. Faster, is that how you do everything? File paperwork instead of asking? She looked up then, and for one unguarded second I saw something almost like humor behind the ice. Yes, she said, it's less likely to be refused. The Provost's wing was another planet from the dorm I shared with 3 other scholarship girls, and a radiator that only worked in July. Floors that didn't creak, windows that didn't stick, a kitchenette stocked with food I recognized only from magazine spreads, and on my second week, a small paper bag waiting on my desk with 2 marigolds pressed flat between wax paper and a note in that same careful, ledger-straight handwriting, for the windowsill you mentioned. I hadn't mentioned it to her. I'd mentioned it to Dee in the archive break room 3 days earlier, thinking no one else was listening. Larkin Voss, it turned out, was always listening. She simply never let you see her do it. The insiders in that wing did not love me for it. Odette Fairweather had reasons of her own to be there: old money, older friendship with the Voss family, an expectation everyone seemed to carry, except Larkin herself, that the 2 of them would eventually be matched. Dynasty to dynasty, the way alphas of a certain pedigree were still quietly matched in rooms I would never be allowed into. She collects strays, Odette told me in the elevator, pleasant as poison. Don't mistake it for anything else. Larkin doesn't choose people. She audits them. I wanted to believe that was jealousy talking. Some nights I wasn't sure it wasn't the truth. There was a locked door at the end of the restricted wing that no key I'd been issued opened, and once, late, I saw Larkin standing in front of it with her hand flat against the wood and her whole spine gone rigid, and when I asked if she was all right, she said, "Fine," in a voice with all the warmth scraped out of it, and didn't speak again for the rest of the night. I started noticing the portrait in the east stairwell, too, a girl who looked enough like Larkin to be her sister, dark-eyed, laughing at something outside the frame, the little brass plaque beneath it worn nearly illegible except for 2 words I could still make out. Sable Voss. No dates. I asked Priya Nandi about it, Larkin's exhausted, unshakable deputy, and Priya's face did something complicated before she said, "Ask Larkin, not me," and found somewhere urgent to be. The first time Larkin touched me on purpose, it was an accident dressed as one. Her hand steadying a folio I was reaching for on a high shelf, her fingers brushing mine, both of us going very still. Her scent bloomed, sudden and unmistakable, warm slate instead of cold, and mine answered before I could stop it, marigold turning honeyed and close. Neither of us moved for 4 full seconds. Then she stepped back like she'd touched a live wire and said, too evenly, "You should use the step stool." Safety, right, I said. Safety. 2 days later, Provost Eleanor Voss summoned me to her office personally, and I understood. Sitting across from a woman who had her daughter's exact eyes and none of her daughter's restraint, that whatever was growing between Larkin and me had already been noticed by someone with far more power to end it than Odette Fairweather would ever have. "You're a bright girl," the provost said, in the tone people use before the word but. "Talented. My daughter doesn't extend opportunities like this casually, Miss Calloway, and I would hate to see you mistake professional regard for something it isn't. Larkin has responsibilities. A legacy. People are watching what she does, and more importantly, who she does it with." A folder slid across the desk toward me. My folder, my financial aid history, my brother's medical bills itemized in black and white like a warning. "It would be a shame if attention like that became inconvenient for you." I left that office with my hands shaking and my scholarship folder feeling, for the first time since Larkin fixed it, dangerously thin again. The trouble found its shape 4 days later in the form of Dean Corliss Hatch standing in the archive doorway with campus security behind him and a smile that had never once meant anything good. "Miss Calloway," he said, savoring it, "I'm afraid we've found some irregularities in your hardship documentation, falsified income statements, forged signatures on your aid renewal." He held up a folder that looked exactly like the one I'd submitted, except it wasn't, quite, a comma out of place, a font weight half a shade too heavy, the kind of difference only someone trained to see ink and paper the way I was trained to see it would catch. "Serious enough for immediate suspension of your enrollment, pending review. Unless, of course, we can find you a more accommodating path forward. There's a sponsorship program, private benefactors, very generous, very discreet. I could put in a word." I understood in the cold drop of my stomach exactly what kind of word he meant, and exactly what kind of program placed vulnerable Omega girls into the private keeping of anonymous rich men, and called it generosity. "That document is forged," I said. "I can prove it. The kerning's wrong, the paper stock doesn't match anything my printers used in 3 years, and there's a signature stroke pattern that doesn't match a single sample of my handwriting on file." Hatch's smile didn't waver. That was the moment I knew he wasn't afraid of being caught. He was counting on the fact that no one had ever believed me before, and saw no reason today would be different. He was wrong about that, but I didn't know it yet. I only knew that late that night, digging through restricted registrar files I technically wasn't cleared to open, hunting for anything that would prove my documents had been altered. I found a case file 11 years old with a name on it that stopped my hands cold. Sable Voss. Withdrawal, voluntary, except nothing about the notes underneath looked voluntary. A professor's name, redacted everywhere except one careless line. A payment. A silence bought with tuition credits and a very generous exit package. And beneath it, in handwriting I now knew as well as my own, a single line added years later, long after the original file was closed. He should have been expelled. I will not let this happen again. LV. I understood, reading it, exactly what Larkin Voss had built herself into, and exactly what it had cost her to become it. I found her in her office an hour before dawn, and she looked up from the file already open on her desk, the same file I realized she'd clearly been staring at for hours, and for the first time since I'd met her, the statute looked like a woman instead of a rule. "My sister," she said, before I could ask, before either of us could pretend I hadn't just walked in holding proof of what I'd found. She presented at 17. Beautiful, reckless, trusting, which this campus punishes. Her jaw worked. A professor used a loophole in the mentorship code to get her a loan for 2 years before anyone believed her. When she finally reported it, the university found a technicality, no rule technically broken. He kept his position. She left in disgrace, with a payout everyone was told to call generous, a breath, thin and controlled. She died 8 months later. They called it an accident, too. "Larkin, I don't tell people that," she said. "I've never told anyone that. I close loopholes, because loopholes are how you lose someone and get told it was nobody's fault." Her eyes lifted to mine, and for once there was nothing careful in them at all. "I have spent 9 years making myself into someone this campus cannot outmaneuver, and the first time in 9 years I have wanted something more than I wanted to be untouchable." Her voice caught, just barely. "Just once. It's you. And I don't know what rule covers that." The office was very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a heating pipe ticked. "There isn't one," I said. "You'd know. You wrote all of them." "Ask me with your words, Briar." Her voice had dropped, rough at the edges in a way I'd never heard from her, alpha command bleeding faintly into it despite every ounce of restraint she was clearly spending to keep it leashed. "Tell me to stop, and I will stop the second you say it. I need to hear you say what you want, not guess it. I want you to kiss me," I said, "before one of us finds another rule to hide behind." She crossed the space between us like she'd been waiting years for permission, and when her mouth found mine, it was careful first, testing, giving me every chance to pull back. And when I didn't, when my hands fisted in the front of her shirt and pulled her closer, the restraint she'd built her whole life around cracked open just enough to let me feel exactly how much it had cost her to hold it. We broke apart at the sound of a door slamming somewhere below us, both breathing hard, her forehead resting against mine. "That door doesn't slam," she said. "Not without someone forcing it." Whatever this was between us, the world outside that office was already coming to collect its interest. The days after that kiss were the best of my entire life, and I would trade every one of them again, knowing what they cost. Larkin didn't hide it once she'd decided. She never did anything by half measures. Least of all this. She started leaving her scent on things without meaning to. A coat over my chair, a mug she'd used left unwashed by mistake, small unconscious claims that made my chest ache every time I found one. She learned that I hadn't eaten a real dinner in 9 days because I'd been sending every spare dollar to Milo's specialist. And the next night, there was a pot of soup on my archive desk that smelled exactly, impossibly, like the one my father used to make. She'd tracked down the recipe from an old family friend of mine I hadn't spoken to in years, just to get the time ratio right. "You didn't have to do that," I told her, throat tight. "I wanted to." She said it the way she said everything, flat and certain, like a rule she'd written and intended to keep. "You've spent your whole life making yourself small enough not to be a burden. I'm not interested in that version of you being the only one that gets fed." I showed her my father's old fountain pen one night, dried up and cracked at the nib, the only thing of his I'd kept, and said nothing about wanting it fixed. 2 days later, it came back to me refilled, the crack sealed by a conservator Larkin had personally driven 40 minutes to find. I cried in the archive stacks and didn't let her see, except she always saw everything, and she held me without a single word until I was done. I told her, one slow rainy afternoon with her head in my lap and her guard entirely, unbelievably down, about presenting at 14 in a school locker room and having a girl announce it to the entire hallway before I'd even understood what was happening to my own body. I told her about my father dying with sawdust in his lungs from 30 years of restoration work nobody paid him enough to protect himself from. I told her about Milo, 12 years old and fighting a lung condition that ate money the way fire eats paper, and how I'd taken every scholarship, every loan, every extra shift, because he was the only family I had left worth fighting for. She told me, in return, what she'd never told anyone: that her mother had raised her on the doctrine that rules were armor, that control was the only love the Voss family knew how to offer, that she had watched her sister die of the exact loophole she now spent every waking hour closing, and had decided at 17 that she would rather be feared than fail anyone else the way the university had failed Sable. Control isn't the same thing as safety, I told her, tracing the line of her jaw. You know that now, don't you? I'm learning it, she said, one rule at a time. Starting with you. A pause, something almost shy moving through eyes that had never once looked shy at me. I keep my word the way I keep the code. To the letter. If I tell you I'll find the light on for you, Briar, I mean it exactly the way I write it. No loopholes. I believed her completely. I still do. We had 4 days like that, warm, quiet, ordinary in a way neither of us had ever been permitted before. Then, Odette Fairweather found the archive access logs, and everything we'd built came apart in an afternoon. The email went to the entire student conduct board before either of us knew it existed. Photographs of me leaving Larkin's private residence at 2 a.m, a doctored financial record, the same forged document Hatch had produced weeks earlier, now resurrected with a new headline, claiming I had used unregistered scent manipulation to influence the provost's daughter's professional judgment, a fabricated ethics violation dressed up in just enough real vocabulary to sound plausible to people who wanted it to be true. By that evening, it was campus-wide. Strangers looked at me in the dining hall like I was something they needed to disinfect. Someone spat the word bait at me in the quad, loud enough for a crowd to hear, loud enough that I felt 14 again, standing in that locker room with no floor under me. Dean Hatch moved fast, faster than even I expected, invoking an emergency conduct hold that suspended my enrollment and my archive clearance in the same breath, citing the manufactured ethics complaint like it was gospel. Larkin was formally recused from my case the moment it hit the board. Conflict of interest, the very rule she'd built her career on, turned now like a blade against her own hand. I can't touch this case, she told me, voice stripped raw, hands hovering like she wanted to hold me, and had been told officially that she no longer had the right. If I intervene now, it hands Hatch everything he needs to bury both of us and call it due process. I have to work this from outside the rule, and it will take days I don't know that we have. Then work it from outside the rule, I said, terrified, furious, trying to sound braver than I felt. You've spent your whole life closing loopholes, Larkin. Find the one that saves me. That night, campus security escorted me, actually escorted, a hand at my elbow like I might run, to a bare, camera-monitored holding room in the administration building, informed I'd be held there pending an emergency hearing, and quietly that a private transport had been arranged for early the next morning to move me to alternate off-campus housing while the investigation continued. The woman who told me that wouldn't meet my eyes when she said it. I understood exactly what kind of housing she meant. I understood, sitting alone on a cot in a room with no window and a door that locked from the outside, that Hatch's sponsorship program had never needed me to be guilty. It had only ever needed me to be alone. I texted Larkin one word before they took my phone. Please, no answer came. Somewhere past midnight, I stopped believing one would. They released me back to my dorm room at 11 that night with a formal warning, a revoked keycard, and a scheduled transport at 6 the next morning that I had no legal ground left to refuse. And I sat on the edge of my narrow bed in the dark with the window latch broken. It had been broken since September. Campus maintenance 3 requests deep in a queue that never moved, and I understood, finally and completely, that I had spent my entire life being the kind of quiet, careful, uncomplaining girl that systems like this one counted on to disappear without a fight. I was still sitting there at 1:30 in the morning when the broken latch gave a soft metallic groan and my window slid open from the outside. I nearly screamed. I would have if the scent hadn't reached me first. Wet slate and black tea, warm instead of cold, unmistakably hers. Larkin Voss climbed through my dormitory window at 1:47 in the morning in direct violation of no fewer than 4 codes she had personally authored: curfew statute, non-fraternization during active review, unauthorized entry to student housing, conflict of interest contact during an open conduct case, and stood there in the dark with her coat torn at one shoulder and her composure gone entirely to pieces. "You're not supposed to be here," I whispered, half laughing, half crying, already crossing the room to her. "I know exactly what I'm not supposed to do," she said, catching my face in both hands like I was the only fixed point left in a world that had come loose from its axis. "I've spent my whole life being the person who follows the rule even when it costs someone I love. I am done being that person tonight." Her thumb traced my cheekbone, and her voice, when it came again, was raw in a way I'd never heard from her. "Hatch's transport leaves in 4 hours. I read the paperwork he filed an hour ago. Breyer, that's not alternate housing. That's a private buyer's residence 40 miles from here, with no university oversight clause and a non-disclosure attached. He's selling you." "I know," I said, and my voice broke on it. "I figured that out around midnight." "I have proof he forged your hardship documents," she said. "I've had it since this afternoon. Ink dating, paper stock, everything you flagged, verified by 3 independent conservators. I have the original Sable Voss file with his signature on the cover-up. I have testimony from 2 other students he's run this exact scheme on before. What I don't have is time to file it through channels that will still be debating jurisdiction while they're loading you into a car." Her hands were shaking, I realized. The statute's hands were shaking. "So I'm not filing it through channels. Get dressed. We're going to the one place on this campus Hatch can't touch before sunrise." "Where?" "My mother's office," Larkin said. "It's time she read her own daughter's case file. All of it. And it's time this whole campus heard what's actually in it." We didn't make it out the front of the dormitory. 2 of Hatch's security contacts were already posted at the stairwell, radios crackling, clearly expecting exactly the kind of trouble a cornered dean might expect to need managing before dawn. Larkin put herself between me and them without a flicker of hesitation, and when the larger one grabbed for my arm, she caught his wrist and turned it hard enough that he went to one knee with a sound I felt more than heard. "Touch her again," she said, voice gone glacial in a way I'd only ever heard aimed at other people, never meant for me to be grateful for, and I will personally see to it that the last thing you touch on this campus is a prison intake form. "Larkin," I said, low, my hand finding her arm. "He's on the ground. That's enough." She looked at me, chest heaving, alpha instinct still lit up bright and dangerous behind her eyes, and something in her hearing my voice reeled her back from whatever edge she'd been standing on. She let the man go. He scrambled backward, radio forgotten, and ran. "That's the second time you've stopped me from becoming someone I don't want to be," she said quietly, pulling me toward the fire stairs. "First, the archive. Now this, somebody has to," I said. "You never stop yourself." We ran the back service corridors of Kingsmere at 2 in the morning, her coat around my shoulders, both of us breathless, and I have never in my life felt more certain of anything than I felt of her hand locked around mine the entire way. Provost Eleanor Voss opened her office door in a robe, silver hair loose, for the first time I'd ever seen it, and looked at her daughter. Disheveled, furious, radiant with a kind of purpose I don't think that woman had seen in her since Sable died. And didn't ask a single question before stepping aside to let us in. "Show me," the provost said. Larkin spread 11 years of evidence across her mother's desk without a word wasted, and I watched something in Eleanor Voss's face collapse and rebuild itself in the space of a single reading. When she finally looked up, she looked, for the first time since I'd met her, less like an institution and more like a woman who had failed one daughter and was watching her second daughter refuse, categorically, to let it happen twice. "Emergency board session," the provost said, already reaching for the phone. 6 a.m., full quorum. "And someone get Dean Hatch out of bed. I want him watching this happen." The hearing room filled by dawn, board members bleary and irritated until the first document went up on the screen, and then not irritated at all. I stood at the podium Larkin had insisted I take, because it was my competence that had caught the forgery in the first place, and she was not going to let anyone diminish that by speaking for me, and I laid out the paper stock analysis, the ink dating, the kerning discrepancy, in the same calm, technical voice my father had taught me to use for testimony that couldn't afford to sound like feeling. Beside me, Larkin presented the Sable Voss file without flinching once, though I felt, through some current I couldn't name, exactly what it cost her to say her sister's name out loud in that room. In front of the mother who had spent 11 years pretending the file was closed. Odette Fairweather's name surfaced in the financial trail within the hour, payments routed through her family's accounts to Hatch's private ledger, compensation for identifying which scholarship students were vulnerable enough to frame. She was escorted out mid-session, composure finally, spectacularly cracked, screaming that none of it would have mattered if Larkin had simply chosen her the way she was supposed to. "I was never going to choose you," Larkin said, not even raising her voice, and the whole room heard it anyway. "That was never a rule. That was your assumption." Dean Corliss Hatch tried denial first, then bluster. Then, when Priya Nandi produced the testimony of 2 former students willing to speak on record at last, a very small, very ugly silence. The board voted for immediate termination, criminal referral, and a full external audit of the sponsorship program within 11 minutes. 11 years of loophole, closed in 11 minutes, because 2 women had refused to let it stay open one day longer. When it was over, when the room had cleared and the sun was fully up over the quad outside the tall windows, Larkin Voss walked across the hearing room, in front of whoever was left to see it, cupped my face in both hands, and kissed me like she'd been given her whole life back in one morning. "Ask me with your words," I said against her mouth, breathless, half laughing. Echoing her own rule back at her. "Marry me," she said. "No hesitation, no loophole. Bond with me. Let the whole campus write it into the record if they want to, because I am done being careful with the one thing I have ever actually wanted." "That's not really a question," I said. "No," she agreed, and for the first time since I'd known her, the statute smiled with nothing held back at all. "It's the one rule I intend to enforce for the rest of my life. Say yes, Briar. Ask me with your words too." "Yes," I said. "Always yes. To all of it." She kissed me again, right there in the wreckage of the hearing room, and her scent bloomed around us both, slate gone warm as sun-struck stone, marigold rising sweet to meet it, and when her mouth finally moved to the curve of my throat, to the place over my scent gland where every nerve in my body had been waiting for her without my permission, She paused with her lips just barely against my skin. "Tell me to stop," she murmured, "and I will." "Don't stop," I said. Not ever again. The bite, when it came, was gentle and certain and absolutely hers, and the bond that opened between us in that instant felt less like being claimed and more like finally, after 21 years, being found. The wedding happened on the first genuinely warm Saturday of spring, in the quad outside the Founders Archive, because Larkin said there was no other place on campus that had ever felt like it belonged to both of us before it belonged to anyone else. Milo walked me down the aisle in a suit 2 sizes too big that he swore he'd grow into by summer, grinning the whole way. Healthy-colored for the first time in 2 years, because Larkin had, without asking me, without making it a transaction, quietly arranged for his treatment to be covered through a university medical trust the same week Hatch's assets were seized and redistributed. Not charity, she'd told me, when I found out and cried into her shoulder for an hour. Restitution. There's a difference, and you taught me to see it. Priya Nandi stood as Larkin's witness, and when it came her turn to speak, she looked out at the small gathered crowd. Loud and weeping and proud, Eleanor Voss, dignified and, for once, undefended, a scattering of students who'd once whispered about the statute with fear and now simply watched her with something closer to awe, and said, in 4 years working under her, I have never once seen Larkin Voss wait for anyone. She waited for this one. That's the whole endorsement I've got. The vows were short, because Larkin didn't believe in wasted words even on the happiest day of her life. I told you I keep my word the way I keep the code, she said, holding both my hands, tea and slate scent gone entirely warm in the sun. To the letter. Today the letter says you. Tomorrow it says you. Every day after it says you. No exceptions, no loopholes, no fine print. That's the only rule I have left, and I intend to enforce it for the rest of my life. Warden, I said, laughing through tears, the old mocking nickname turned soft as anything. That might be the least legally binding vow I've ever heard. It's the only one I've ever meant with my whole self, she said. Marry it anyway. I did. 6 months later, Odette Fairweather's family name had been quietly and permanently removed from every donor plaque on campus, her degree revoked pending the fraud investigation's conclusion. Dean Corliss Hatch was serving the first year of a sentence that would keep him well past retirement age, his sponsorship program dismantled, and its records handed to a task force investigating 3 other campuses running the same scheme. The locked door at the end of the restricted wing was locked no longer. Larkin had turned Sable's old office into a resource center for Omega students, staffed and funded and named, at last, out loud. A year on, Milo spent his summer break as an unpaid, hopelessly enthusiastic archive intern, learning paper conservation from the woman who taught it to me, in the building where I still worked most nights, though now I came home instead of staying. Our apartment windows had a real latch, brand new, and a row of marigolds Larkin tended with the same exacting seriousness she brought to everything, muttering over watering schedules like they were campus statutes she intended to enforce. I found her one morning at the kitchen table before dawn, the old leather notebook open in front of her, adding something in that careful, ledger-straight hand. When she saw me watching, she didn't try to hide the page. Rule 1, it read, above every statute she'd ever written, first and above all the rest, choose her, no exceptions. Morning light came through the new window and lay warm across both our hands where they'd found each other on the table without either of us reaching first, and I understood, finally, the whole shape of what had happened to me since a stranger in a slate-gray coat decided a drenched, invisible scholarship girl was worth defending. Being overlooked had never been the truth of me. it had only ever been the world's failure to look properly. Somewhere out there, every rule that was ever used to keep a quiet girl small is still waiting to be rewritten by someone brave enough to break in and prove her wrong. The end.